In the 5th century, as the Western Roman Empire was breaking up politically and the kingdoms of early medieval Europe were taking form, the militaries of these new kingdoms were clearly recognizable as Roman armies. But, by the end of the 6th century, those structures had almost completely changed, which has led some medievalists, such as Guy Halsall, to label this the 6th century military revolution. So in this video, we're going to condense the argument and check it out. The militaries of the late Roman Empire were funded principally through three means, either through the state by direct payment, or through being allotted tax revenue in some areas, or taxes in kind, or through the personal funds of some of their commanders. However, throughout the course of the 5th century, the Roman Empire in the West shrank in size, and as a result, tax revenue also shrank. The end result of this was that the practice of hiring troops from beyond the frontier increased. Saying that the barbarians had a complex relationship with the Roman Empire is something of an understatement. There is an older argument that the resulting recruitment of barbarians led to the barbarization of the Roman military and thus its weakness, but this has since been challenged and rejected since about the 1980s. What was actually happening was that the Roman army had, by the 5th century, developed its own identity, one that was distinct from civilians, and barbarian fashion and some customs were adopted as a way of doing this, with the actual Latin of the military being heavily spiced with German. The increased recruitment of non-Romans led, by the 6th century, to armies usually being raised from those who did not hold a Roman ethnic identity. During the late Empire, groups such as the Goths took on the role of soldiers. To be a soldier was to be a Goth, it's just what they did. And in the aftermath of the Western Empire's collapse, this appears to have been reinforced. Non-Romans typically formed the militaries and Romans formed the civilians of post-imperial states, and they were often paid through taxes on the Roman civilians, and the soldiers were often able to hold land and have that land be considered tax-exempt, as imperial armies had. In this system, which appears to have been hereditary in most areas of the post-Roman West in the late 5th and early 6th centuries, soldiers initially received military training by serving under established soldiers, warrior aristocrats, or kings, up until about the age of 20, when they married and established families and households of their own, and would take younger men on to train. All of these people, when the time came, were expected to show up when summoned for a campaign. It was in this context, warfare and the establishment of households, that ethnic identity appears to have been formally acquired. One was formally a Frank when one became a warrior. As imperial institutions failed, Roman bureaucrats and other members of the governmental patronage network began to look elsewhere for those who could provide similar structures. Essentially, what happens is that in the post-Roman West, the aristocrats become militarized, and notions of masculinity become attached to war, and they came to rely on the influence and patronage of the king. Through these means, kings, who looked to the Old Testament warrior monarch David for inspiration and guidance, were able to raise armies based around ideas of ethnic military service, led at the local level by aristocrats, civil administrators, and warrior bishops. Over the course of the 6th century, however, this situation would rapidly change, especially in the kingdom of the Franks, the post-Roman state with the best available evidence. The ability to hold land and be exempt from certain taxes made holding non-Roman ethnicity extremely attractive. And by the early 6th century, we see across the post-Roman West the aristocracy and the military becoming drawn from people who did not identify as Roman. In the long run, this led to structural changes. Ethnicity seems to have been something that was acquired in the post-Roman West, and many of our surviving sources make it clear that the number of those serving in the military was increasing, and their families were taking on non-Roman identities, meaning that the tax base, to whatever extent it was still around and effective, began to shrink once more, as Roman citizens were the ones usually paying taxes. If there are less people who identify as Roman, eventually you'll have less of a tax base. Militarized lands also passed into the hands of women and others who were considered unfit for military duty, despite their identity as a Frank or a Goth or some other barbarian, and this appears to have reduced the amount of land subject specifically to royal taxation. Going along with this shift in the tax base and the expansion of the military, the equipment also appears to have changed significantly. For the 50 years between 575 and 625, weapons burials, which form the bulk of our evidence for this subject, stopped turning up the famous Franciscas, the Frankish throwing axes, as well as various other types of javelins and one-handed battle axes and angons, a type of heavy, barbed javelin known to be used by the Franks in the Angles. The sword enters a period of decline in the 7th century, being replaced by larger, heavier saxes, and which possibly replaces the battle axe until the start of the Viking Age, with the most prominent type of weapon being the spear, whose heads grow significantly longer. Unfortunately, we don't know that much about the armor in Western Europe in this period, because we have very little of it when compared with the weapons that survive. The changes to the equipment, especially in the Merovingian kingdom, suggest that changes were taking place. The Francisca, for example, appears to have been a weapon which required specialized training to use, while spears required less. Whether or not that is or was actually true, we do know that changes were being made in regards to who actually served in post-Roman militaries. By the end of the 6th century, we start seeing a word appear in the sources from Western Europe, scare, from which we get the English word shear. With the general breakdown of the Roman tax system and Roman trade, having everyone who identified as a non-Roman being eligible for military service, and thus having an army numbering in the thousands, wasn't feasible. Military households appear to have dominated service in the late 6th and the early 7th centuries. With the increase in liability for military service, as larger numbers of the population were identifying as non-Roman and thus eligible, it became important to select those who were actually trained, and not just rally a band of peasants because they happened to be Frankish or Gothic or Saxon. The nobility, who had the resources to maintain troops, continued the practice of having young warriors train under more seasoned ones, but towards the end of the 6th century they weren't necessarily allowed to go off and form their own families. They could do so, of course, but they had to remain in the service of the noble. As this was happening, the last remnants of the tax system disappeared, at least for a little while, and as a result, warriors were dependent on their lords for support. Because of this, the nobility appears to have been able to come between the general population, who could fight, and the kings, and thus came to dominate military recruitment. Hence the word which shows up in late 6th and early 7th century sources, scare. The nobility were shearing off the best warriors from the general population. This is a long way from systems of recruitment in the High Middle Ages, what we sometimes think of as feudal levies, but we do see something of a privatization of the military in this period, and a complete move away from Roman power structures and Roman military organization, hence the argument for a 6th century military revolution.